My grandfather August passed on a Tuesday in late October, and I got the call while I was sitting at my desk trying to finish a report I no longer remember the subject of. He was 81 years old and had lived alone in the same house in rural West Virginia for the last 40 years of his life. I had not seen him in 3 years. We were not estranged exactly, but August was the kind of man who kept distance the way other people kept furniture. He filled the space around him with it and never seemed to notice anyone who got crowded out. I drove down to handle the estate because there was no one else. His house sat at the end of a gravel road surrounded by old oak trees that had grown so tall they blocked most of the sky. The inside smelled like pipe tobacco and old paper, and something underneath both of those things that I could not name. I spent the first 2 days sorting through what could be donated and what needed to go to the trash. August had not been a collector of anything sentimental. His shelves held field manuals and topographic references, and a row of identical green notebooks that all turned out to be blank. The furniture was plain and functional and gave nothing away about who he had been as a person. I was starting to think I had driven 6 hours to learn absolutely nothing about my grandfather when I found the trunk. It was in the attic, pushed against the far wall under a canvas drop cloth that was stiff with age. The trunk itself was military issue from the looks of it, with August's initials stamped into the leather strap across the top. Inside, I found folded survey maps, a broken compass, a pair of leather gloves worn down to nothing at the fingertips, and underneath all of it a false bottom that only revealed itself when the weight of the other contents was removed. The panel beneath was thin plywood cut to fit and held in place with 2 small hook latches. I almost missed it entirely. Underneath was the journal. It was smaller than I expected, bound in dark brown leather with no title on the cover and no name inside the front flap. The pages were dense with handwriting that leaned hard to the right, as if written in a hurry. The ink had faded to a pale brown in most places, but the words were still legible if I held the pages at the right angle to the light. Tucked between several of the pages were folded sheets of heavier paper covered in charcoal drawings. I unfolded the first one and sat back on my heels without meaning to. The sketch showed a tunnel. The walls were smooth and curved and covered in repeating geometric patterns that looked deliberate and studied. The scale of the thing was suggested by 2 small human figures drawn at the entrance, and the tunnel dwarfed them completely. I told myself it was a drawing of something August had read about or imagined. I told myself that for about 10 minutes before I unfolded the second sketch. That one showed a chamber, wide and low-ceilinged, with dozens of narrow archways leading off in different directions. Carved shelving ran along every wall, and on the shelves were objects I could not identify from the drawing alone. In the center of the chamber stood 3 figures that were not the small human silhouettes from the first sketch. These were taller. The proportions were off in a way that took me a moment to process. The limbs were too long. The heads were slightly too large. The posture suggested they were standing completely still in total darkness, and had been for some time. I called Viv that night. She was the only person I knew with a background in geological survey, and more importantly, she was the only person I trusted to look at something like this without immediately telling me to throw it away. She drove out the next morning, and we spent the better part of 2 days working through the journal together. August had written in a personal shorthand that mixed standard abbreviations with symbols he had invented himself. It took Viv most of the first day just to build a working key. Once we had it, the entries came through fast. August had been a field surveyor contracted by the federal government in 1941. His territory was a stretch of Appalachian backcountry that had been flagged for mineral assessment. He had worked the same grid for 2 years without incident. Then, in the spring of 1943, his notes changed. The handwriting got smaller. The entries got longer. The sketches started appearing between every few pages instead of occasionally. Whatever August found in the spring of 1943 had changed the entire shape of how he recorded his work. We read through the shift in his tone, sitting at his kitchen table with the journal between us and a pot of coffee going cold on the counter. Viv pointed to an entry near the middle of the journal where August had written a single line apart from everything else. It was not in shorthand. It was plain English, and it read, "They have been here since before we had a word for the ground we walk on." I looked at Viv and she looked at me, and neither of us said anything for a while. Near the back of the journal, August had sketched a topographic overview of a hillside with a tunnel entrance marked at the base. Below the sketch, he had written a set of coordinates in plain numerals with no code. I entered them into my phone. The pin dropped 12 miles from where we were sitting. I set my phone face down on the table. Viv picked it up, looked at the screen, and set it back down the same way. We did not talk about going. We just both knew that we were. The drive out took 40 minutes on roads that got narrower the further we went from town. Viv had the journal open in her lap and was rereading August's early entries while I drove. She said twice that the geometric patterns in the tunnel sketches matched no known cave formation process. She had seen a lot of cave systems in her work, and natural erosion does not produce repeating symmetrical carvings across hundreds of feet of stone wall. I kept my eyes on the road. The coordinates led us off the last paved road onto a fire trail that my truck handled badly. We parked where the trail ended at a rusted gate and walked the rest of the way in. The forest was old growth and dense, and the light dropped fast once we were under the canopy. August's topographic sketch turned out to be accurate in a way that should not have been possible given its age. The hillside was exactly where he had drawn it. The slope, the rock shelf at the base, the particular way the tree line broke to the left. All of it matched. The tunnel entrance was set into the base of the hill behind a fall of old stone that had shifted enough over the decades to partially block the opening. It was not fully blocked. There was a gap wide enough to walk through if you turned sideways. I shone my flashlight into the gap, and the beam disappeared into a darkness that did not reflect back. Viv checked the coordinates one more time against the journal sketch. She looked at the entrance.
She looked at me.
She pulled her flashlight from her pack and clicked it on without another word. I turned sideways and stepped through first. The inside of the tunnel was cold in a way that felt deliberate. Not the damp chill of a natural cave, but a dry, steady cold that sat at the same temperature no matter how deep we moved. The floor was flat, and the walls curved upward in a smooth arc that met at a point maybe 12 feet above our heads. I ran my flashlight along the left wall and stopped. The carvings were there exactly as August had sketched them. Geometric patterns pressed deep into the stone in long, repeating bands. Triangles nested inside larger triangles. Lines that ran parallel for several feet, then converged at a single point before spreading apart again. I traced one of the lines with my finger and felt how clean the edge was. Whatever tool had made these marks had been precise. Viv was already photographing the right wall, with her phone moving the light slowly across each section. She said the stone composition was wrong for natural Appalachian formation. She said it quietly, the way she said most things. I moved further in, and my flashlight picked up the first branch tunnel. It split off to the right at a gentle angle and disappeared into the dark. The entrance to it was framed by two vertical carved pillars that had been cut directly from the rock. I checked August's sketch. The branch tunnel was on his map. He had marked it with a small symbol that Viv and I had translated during our key work as the word used or traveled. We stayed on the main passage. It ran deeper than the exterior of the hill should have allowed. I kept track of our distance by counting steps, and by the time I reached 300 steps, I understood that we were no longer under the hill. We were under something larger. The passage leveled out and widened, and our flashlights stopped reaching the far wall. Viv put her hand on my arm and pointed her beam at the floor. The dust there was undisturbed in a way that meant nothing had walked the section in a very long time. But the walls on either side showed fresh tool marks. Not old carvings. Recent work. stone that had been cleared and smoothed within what looked like the last few years. I looked at Viv. She looked at the fresh marks. She did not say anything. Neither did I. I turned my flashlight toward the deeper dark ahead, and that was when I noticed August's initials cut into the wall at eye level just to the right of where I was standing. A and K inside a small rough circle. Below the initials was a date. Spring 1943. Below the date were 4 words carved in the same careful hand as the initials. They were not in code. They were not in shorthand. They read, "Do not come back." I stood reading those 4 words for longer than I should have. Viv read them over my shoulder, and I felt her go still beside me. The silence in the tunnel had been complete since we entered. No drip of water, no shift of stone, no movement of air. So when the sound started from somewhere ahead of us in the dark, it was the only thing in the world. It was low. It was rhythmic. It repeated at steady intervals, like something marking time. It was not mechanical. It was not water. It was not anything I could explain away standing there in the cold with August's warning still fresh on the wall beside me. It was moving toward us at a pace that was neither fast nor slow. It was the pace of something that had nowhere else to be and all the time in the world to get there. I clicked off my flashlight without deciding to. Viv did the same a half-second later. We stood in the complete dark and listened to it close the distance between us, one steady beat at a time, and neither of us moved. The sound did not speed up. That was the first thing I noticed standing there in the dark with my flashlight off and my back against the carved stone wall. Whatever was making it was not reacting to us. It was not hunting. It was moving at the same interval it had started with, and that steadiness was somehow worse than if it had charged. Viv touched my sleeve, and I felt her shift her weight toward the entrance behind us. I agreed without saying anything. We moved back the way we came with our flashlights still off, using the wall as a guide. I kept my right hand flat against the carvings and counted my steps backward. The sound continued behind us at the same pace. It did not follow. It did not stop. It simply continued, as if we were not a factor in whatever it was doing. We reached the entrance gap, and I went through, first scraping my shoulder on the stone. The outside air hit my face, and I had not realized how much I needed it until that moment. Viv came through behind me, and we walked fast without running. Neither of us spoke until we reached the truck. I started the engine and backed down the fire trail with the headlights cutting through the tree line, and Viv sat with the journal open on her knees, reading by the glow of her phone. She did not look up until we hit the paved road. She said the sound matched a description August had written in the middle section of the journal. He had called it a keeping sound. He wrote that it was not communication and not warning. He wrote that it was something closer to counting. I asked her what that meant. She said she did not know yet. We drove back to August's house and spread everything out on the kitchen table. Viv worked through the journal's middle entries while I made coffee and tried to organize what we had seen against what August had sketched. The fresh tool marks in the tunnel wall bothered me more than the sound had. The carvings in the outer section of the tunnel were old. The weathering on them was consistent with decades of exposure to the same dry, cold air we had walked through. But the cleared and smooth section further in had no weathering at all. The stone there was bright where it had been worked. It had been done recently and done with tools that left no mark pattern I could connect to anything human. Viv found the entry she was looking for just after midnight. August had written it in the spring of 1943, about 3 weeks into whatever it was he had stumbled into. He described going back to the tunnel entrance after his first encounter. He wrote that he had told himself he was going back to document what he had seen for the geological record. He wrote that he knew that was not the real reason. The real reason was that whatever was down there had not hurt him, and he needed to understand why. His second visit had taken him deeper than the first. He had followed the main passage past the branch tunnels, past the widened chamber, and into a section of the tunnel system that opened without warning into something he had not been prepared for. He called it the deep floor. He described it as a cavern so large that his lantern light could not find the ceiling or the far wall. The floor of it was flat and smooth and covered in an arrangement of low stone structures that he could only describe as buildings. Not natural formations, not random piles of rock. Buildings. Low-roofed and precisely cornered with openings that served as doors and interior spaces that he could see contained objects arranged with obvious intention. He had stood at the edge of the deep floor for a long time before he understood that the cavern was occupied. The figures he had sketched in that second charcoal drawing were not hypothetical. He had seen them standing in the space between the structures. 3 of them, motionless, facing the direction he had come from, as if they had known he was there before he arrived. August wrote that he did not run. He wrote that running had not seemed like an option that would work. He stood at the edge of the light, and they stood in the dark, and nothing happened for a long time. Then one of them moved. It walked toward him at a slow, deliberate pace, and stopped at the edge of his lantern light where the dark and the pale yellow glow met. It stood there, and he stood there, and August wrote that he looked at it as clearly as his nerve allowed. It was tall, taller than any person he had encountered in his life. The skin was the color of limestone and smooth in the way that things are smooth when they have never been exposed to sun or wind or friction. The eyes were there, but they were filmed over. Not blind exactly. Something between blind and sighted in a way that suggested the distinction did not apply to it the way it applied to him. It did not speak. It did not gesture. It simply stood at the edge of the light and waited. August wrote that after a long time he understood that it was waiting for him to decide something. He did not know what the decision was. He wrote that he stayed in the tunnel for another hour before he turned and walked back out, and that the figure did not follow, but that he felt it watching him until the entrance gap was behind him and the open air was on his face. Viv set the journal down after reading that entry aloud. She picked up her coffee and drank it without saying anything. I looked at the sketches spread across the table. The proportions in them were accurate. August had not exaggerated the height or the limb length or the filmed-over quality of the eyes. He had drawn what he had seen with the precision of a man who understood that no one would believe him and had decided to document it anyway. I asked Viv what she thought. She said she thought we needed to go back. I told her August had carved "Do not come back" into the wall of that tunnel with his own hands. She said she knew that. She said she also knew that the fresh tool marks we had seen were not from the 1940s. Something had been working in that tunnel recently. Something had been expanding it or clearing it or preparing it for a purpose we did not have enough information to understand yet. She said that August's journal was 80 years old, and whatever he had encountered had kept moving forward in that time, whether or not anyone above ground had been paying attention. I looked at the coordinates on my phone. I looked at the journal. I looked at Viv. She was already checking the batteries in her flashlight. We went back the next morning. I had slept 4 hours on August's couch, and Viv had slept in the spare room, and neither of us mentioned what we were planning over breakfast. We just packed our gear and got in the truck. The drive felt shorter the second time. The fire trail felt more familiar. The forest felt less like something neutral and more like something that knew we had been there before. The tunnel entrance was exactly as we had left it. The gap in the fallen stone unchanged. The cold that came through it hit me before I was fully inside. We moved faster this time. I knew the step count to the widened section, and I knew where the branch tunnel split off, and I knew where August's initials were carved into the wall. We passed them without stopping. The forward warning caught my eye as we went by, and I kept moving. The widened section opened up around us, and Viv swung her flashlight across the fresh tool marks again. There were more of them than there had been the day before. I stopped walking. Viv stopped beside me. The cleared and smoothed area had extended further along the wall overnight. Someone or something had been working in this tunnel between yesterday afternoon and this morning. The marks were still bright. The stone dust from the work had not even fully settled. It lay in a thin, pale film across the floor at our feet. Viv crouched and touched it with 2 fingers. She looked up at me and said it was still warm. I took one more step forward, and my flashlight beam caught the edge of something on the far wall that I had not seen on the first visit. It was a carving, recent, cut into the newly worked stone with the same clean precision as the ancient geometric patterns further back. It was not geometric. It was a name. My name, Callum, cut into the stone of a tunnel that August had first entered 80 years ago. Beneath it was a second name, Viv. Beneath both names was a single symbol that we had translated from August's key 2 days earlier sitting at his kitchen table. We had written the translation in the margin of our notes without thinking much of it at the time. The symbol meant expected. I stood looking at my name in fresh-cut stone and tried to find a rational explanation that held together. I could not find one. Viv stood beside me, and I could hear her breathing change. Not panic. She was not the kind of person who panicked, but her breathing shifted to the controlled kind that people use when they are deciding whether to be afraid. I took a photo of the carving with my phone. My hands were steady, and I was mildly surprised by that. We had come back to understand something, and we were understanding it faster than I had expected. Something in this tunnel knew our names. Something in this tunnel had known we would return before we had decided to return ourselves. The journal had been hidden in August's attic for 80 years, and inside 2 days of finding it, we were standing underground with our names cut into the wall in front of us. I thought about August carving Do Not Come Back and spending the last 40 years of his life alone at the end of a gravel road and never telling anyone what he had found. I thought about the blank green notebooks on his shelf. All those pages he had chosen not to fill. Viv turned her flashlight back toward the deeper passage ahead. The keeping sound was not there. The tunnel ahead was completely silent. She looked at me, and I knew what she was asking without her saying it. I thought about the fresh stone dust still warm under our feet. I thought about the symbol beneath our names. I thought about the figure August had described standing at the edge of his lantern light waiting for him to make a decision. I nodded.
We moved forward together into the deeper dark with our lights cutting ahead of us and the silence pressing in from every direction. The passage sloped downward at a gentle grade, and the walls narrowed slightly as we descended. Then, without any transition, the walls fell away and the ceiling disappeared, and we were standing at the edge of something vast. Our flashlight beams reached out ahead of us and found nothing. No far wall, no ceiling, just dark in every direction, and below us a floor that dropped away in a long natural shelf before leveling out into the space August had called a deep floor. We stood at the edge and looked down. The low stone structures were there, dozens of them arranged in a pattern that was too deliberate to be anything but planned. And between them in the space below, nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. The cavern was completely still, but every single structure had a light source inside it, faint and cold and blue, glowing through the narrow door openings in steady pulses, like breathing. We stood at the edge of the shelf for a long time, looking down at the blue light pulsing out of those doorways. I counted the structures from where we stood. 31. Maybe more further back in the dark, where our beams did not reach. The light coming from each one was identical in color and rhythm, all of them breathing at the same rate. I thought about the word August had used, architecture. He had called it architecture in his journal, and standing there looking at it, I understood why. This was not a natural formation that something had moved into. This had been built. The corners were true. The walls were plumb. The doorways were size of intention. Whatever had constructed this place had done so with the same deliberate precision that had carved the tunnel walls above us. Viv moved her flashlight slowly across the full width of the cavern below, and I watched the beam travel without finding an edge. She said it quietly. She said the cavern was at least 400 feet across, and probably more. She said the ceiling above the structures was too high for her light to reach. I asked her how deep underground she thought we were. She said deep enough that no survey team had ever mapped this, and deep enough that sound from the surface would not carry here. I thought about how completely no one knew where we were. We had not told anyone. August's house was empty. Our phone showed no signal. I looked at the carved shelf edge where we were standing and saw that it was not a natural drop. Steps had been cut into it. Wide, flat steps descending at a gradual angle toward the deep floor. The edges of the steps were worn smooth in the center of the way stone gets when it has been walked thousands of times. I put my foot on the first step, and Viv did not stop me. She fell in beside me, and we went down together. The air changed as we descended. It got warmer. Not warm the way a heated room is warm, but warm the way something living makes the air warm just by being in it. The blue light from the nearest structure grew stronger as we reached the floor, and I could see it clearly now. It was not fire. It was not electric. It was organic. Something inside the structure was producing it the way certain deep-sea creatures produce light. A biological process. Cold and steady and completely silent. Viv crouched at the doorway of the nearest structure and looked inside without crossing the threshold.
She described what she saw in a low, flat voice like she was filing a report. Shelving along every wall. Objects on the shelves that she could not identify. A low platform in the center that might have been a table or might have been something else entirely. The light source was in the ceiling. A cluster of pale growth clinging to the stone above and radiating that cold blue pulse. She stood back up, and we moved along the front of the structures, staying in the space between them. The layout was grid. Rows and columns with narrow passages between each structure wide enough for one person to walk through. I pulled out the journal and found August's sketch of the deep floor. He had drawn the grid from above. The proportions matched what we were walking through almost exactly. He had been here. He had walked these same passages between these same structures 80 years ago and had drawn what he saw with enough accuracy that I could use his sketch as a map. I found north on the sketch by matching a distinctive cluster of 3 structures in the corner to what I could see ahead of us. August had marked a location near the center of the grid with a small circle, and inside the circle a single word from a shorthand that Viv and I had translated as gathering. We moved toward it. The passages between the structures were completely silent. No sound from inside any of them. No movement. The blue light pulsed at the same rate from every source. I had the feeling of walking through something that was functioning perfectly in our absence. Not abandoned. Not dormant. Simply running on its own schedule without requiring anyone to be present. We reached the center of the grid and found the gathering space. It was an open area roughly circular where the grid pulled back to leave a clearing maybe 30 feet across. The floor of it was different from the rest of the deep floor. It was carved. The same geometric patterns from the tunnel walls, but denser and more complex, covering every inch of the clearing floor in bands that spiraled outward from the center. In the center was a single flat stone roughly the size of a dining table. Smooth on top, carved on every side. On top of the stone sat an object. I recognized it immediately. It was a journal, older than August's, bound in something that was not leather. Cracked and dark with age, and sitting in the exact center of the flat stone as if it had been placed there deliberately for someone to find. I looked at Viv. She looked at the journal on the stone.
She said, "Do not touch it yet."
I said I was not going to touch it yet. We circled the stone slowly with our flashlights moving across every carved surface. The symbols on the sides of the stone were the same writing system as August's carvings. Dense and layered and covering every inch. Viv photographed all of it. I opened August's journal to the gathering page and compared his sketch to what I was looking at. He had sketched the flat stone. He had sketched the object on top of it. In his notes beside the sketch, he had written a single line in plain English the way he did when something was too important for code. The line read, "This is how they keep track of what comes down and what goes up." I read that line twice. I looked at the journal sitting on the stone. I looked at the passages around us leading back through the grid of structures with their cold blue light. Then I heard it. Not the keeping sound from before. Something different. From every passage around the clearing at the same moment. Movement. Slow and deliberate, and coming from multiple directions at once. Not running. Not rushing. The unhurried movement of things that had all the time they needed and knew exactly where we were. Viv grabbed my arm and pulled me back from the stone. We moved to the edge of the clearing and pressed against the nearest structure wall. I killed my flashlight. She killed hers a second later. The blue light from the structures gave just enough glow to see shapes by, and I used it. The first figure came out of the passage to the left.
Tall.
Moving with that same long-limbed, unhurried pace that August had described. It crossed the clearing without looking at us and stopped at the flat stone. A second figure emerged from the passage directly across. Then a third from the right. They gathered around the stone in silence, and I watched them from the edge of the light. They did not speak. They did not gesture at each other. They simply stood around the stone in a loose arrangement, and whatever communication was happening between them was not happening in any register I could detect. I pressed my back harder against the wall and felt the stone behind me hum. Not a sound exactly. A frequency moving through the rock from somewhere below and up through my spine. Viv felt it too. The figures at the stone were not looking at us. Their filmed-over eyes oriented toward each other and toward whatever they were sharing through the stone beneath our feet. I counted 5. A sixth came from the far passage. I opened August's journal as quietly as I could manage and found his entry about first contact. He had written that they do not acknowledge what they have already cataloged. He had written that once they know you are there, you become part of the record, and the record does not require your participation. I thought about our names cut into the tunnel wall above us. I thought about the symbol for expected. I understood then that we had not surprised anyone by coming here.
We had fulfilled something.
Viv leaned close to my ear and said one word.
She said door.
I looked where she was pointing. Behind us, at the base of the structure wall, was a low opening. Not a main doorway. A secondary passage cut low into the stone that angled away from the clearing. It was not on August's sketch. It was not marked. It was just there, dark and narrow, and leading somewhere other than back through the figures standing at the center stone. None of the figures had moved toward us. The humming continued at the same frequency. I got on my hands and knees and went through the opening first. The passage beyond kept me crawling for 20 feet with one hand on each wall to stay centered. Viv came in behind me, and I heard her breathing at my heels. The passage turned twice and began to rise at an angle steep enough that I used my hands against the floor to push forward. The stone under my palms was cold again. The warmth of the deep floor was gone. I could feel the temperature dropping with each foot of elevation we gained. I switched my flashlight back on. The passage kept going and I kept climbing. The passage leveled off and widened enough to stand. We were in a narrow connecting corridor running perpendicular to the main tunnel system. The walls were rough, not carved with the same precision as the passages below, cruder in a way that suggested different purpose. I ran my flashlight along the length of it. It ended at a wall to the left. To the right, it curved out of sight after 40 feet. We went right. The corridor curved and opened into a vertical shaft. The walls showed the same faint tool marks as the cleared section in the upper tunnel. The shaft went straight up, and at the top a thin gray light filtered down. Daylight through soil and root. I looked at Viv. She looked up at the light. The shaft had handholds cut into one wall, worn smooth from use. I went first. The handholds were spaced for something with a longer reach than mine, but they worked. I climbed without stopping, and the gray light grew stronger with every hold. I pushed through roots at the top and came out on the forest floor near the tree line. I lay on my back in the dead leaves and looked at the sky. Late afternoon. We had been underground for over 4 hours. Viv came up behind me and sat against a tree with her eyes closed. The forest was quiet, but the right kind of quiet. Birds in the distance. Wind in the upper branches. I sat up and looked at the hole we had come out of. It was mostly hidden by root growth and would be invisible from more than a few feet away. I pulled out my phone. 1 bar of signal. I checked her location. We were on the far side of the hill from the tunnel entrance, 200 meters from where we had parked. Viv was reading the journal. She looked up and said the journal on the stone was a census record. August had described it in an entry I had not reached yet. A living document, updated continuously. She turned the page toward me. August had written that the census tracked everything that had ever entered the tunnel system. Every name, every date, every outcome. She looked at me over the top of the page. She said August had written one more thing about the census record on the stone. He had written that there were 2 kinds of entries in it. Those who came down and went back up, and those who came down and did not. We walked back to the truck without talking. The 200 meters felt longer than it should have, and I kept my eyes moving across the tree line the whole way. Nothing followed us out of the shaft. Nothing moved in the forest that I could see. But the forest had a quality to it now that it had not had before we went underground. A stillness that felt less like absence and more like attention. I got in the truck and locked the doors before I had thought about doing it. Viv got in on the passenger side and set the journal on the dash. I started the engine and backed out the way we had come. Neither of us spoke until we hit the paved road. She said 2 kinds of entries. I said I heard you the first time. She said we needed to figure out which kind August was before we did anything else. I did not argue with that. We drove back to August's house, and I made food, while Viv went through the journal from the middle entries forward. She was building a timeline. August's first entry was from March of 1943. His last entry had no date on it.
Just a time.
3:14 in the morning. The handwriting was different from every other entry. Not rushed the way the middle entries were rushed, but deliberate. Like someone writing slowly because they wanted every word to be correct. Viv read it to me while I ate. August had written that he was leaving the journal where Callum would find it. My name. Not my father's name. Not a generic future reader. My name. He had written it in plain English the same way he wrote the things that were too important for code. He had written that he was sorry for the distance between them and that the distance had been necessary.
He had written that the deal he made in the tunnel in the spring of 1943 had kept him alive for 80 years and had cost him everything that made being alive worth anything. He wrote that the terms of the deal were simple. His safety in exchange for information, names of surface dwellers, locations, schedules. He had been feeding them data about the world above for 8 decades, not in large quantities, enough to satisfy whatever accounting they kept in that census on the flat stone, enough to keep his name in the column of those who came up and did not go back down. He had picked people carefully. He wrote that. He had picked people who were already gone, missing persons, people who had no family looking for them, people the surface world had already lost track of. He told himself that made it acceptable. He wrote that he had stopped believing that somewhere around 1962. Viv set the journal down. She did not say anything for a moment. I pushed my plate to the side and sat with my hands flat on the table. August had been a quiet man who lived alone at the end of a gravel road and never let anyone get close. And I was beginning to understand why. Every person he let close was a name he might have to give eventually. The distance had not been cruelty. It had been protection, or as close to protection as a man could manage while doing what he had been doing. I asked Viv if the journal said what happened when the deal ended. She said it said the deal did not end. She said August had written that the deal was not between him and the thing he had met in the tunnel in 1943. The deal was structural. It was part of how they operated. Surface information in exchange for surface access. She turned to a page near the back. August had sketched a diagram. 2 columns. Left column showed a series of symbols descending in a line. Right column showed the same symbols, but each one had a mark beside it, a status mark. She pointed to the symbol at the bottom of the left column and said August had labeled it in plain English. It was labeled current. I looked at the diagram. The current symbol had no status mark beside it, no record of outcome. She said that meant the deal was still open. It had passed from August to whoever found the journal next. The deal did not close when August died. It transferred. I sat with that for a while. The kitchen was quiet. The house was quiet. Outside, the windows of the dark had fully settled, and the trees were black shapes against a slightly less black sky. I asked Viv what the deal required now. She turned to the last written page of the journal, not the last entry. The last page with anything on it at all. August had written 3 lines. The first line said the coordinates to the tunnel entrance. The second line said the census on the flat stone would need a new entry before the next full moon. The third line said the entry required a name, not a missing person this time. The terms had changed since 1943. What they wanted now was someone the person carrying the deal actually knew. I read those 3 lines. I looked at Viv. She was already looking at me. I could see her working through the same thing I was working through. We both knew what the journal was asking. We both knew what August had set in motion by leaving it where I would find it. I pushed back on the table and walked to the window. The backyard was dark and flat and ended at a tree line that I could not see past. I stood there looking at nothing for a long time. Then I heard something from the backyard, low and rhythmic, the keeping sound, but not from underground this time, from outside, from somewhere between the back porch and the trees, moving neither fast nor slow, steady, patient, already closer than it should have been. I stepped back from the window without turning the kitchen light off. That was instinct. If I turned the light off, whatever was outside would know I had heard it. I left the light on and walked to the hallway and kept my voice low when I told Viv. She came to the hallway without her flashlight. Smart. She pressed against the wall beside the window frame and looked out at an angle that kept her face out of the direct line of sight from outside. She looked for about 5 seconds and pulled back. She held up 2 fingers. 2 of them. In the backyard. I thought about the census on the flat stone. I thought about the symbol for expected. I thought about my name already carved into the tunnel wall before we had even decided to go back. I went to the front door and checked the lock. Locked. I checked the back door. Locked. I went through every ground floor window in the house and checked the latches. August's house was old, but the locks were not. Every latch was new, recently replaced. August had replaced every lock in the house at some point, and I understood now that he had done it for exactly this reason. The keeping sound continued outside at the same interval, not pressing against the house, not testing the doors, just present, marking something. I went back to the kitchen table and picked up the journal and read the last page again. The terms had changed since 1943. A name. Someone the carrier of the deal actually knew. I set the journal down and looked at Viv. She was watching me from the hallway. I said I was not going to give them a name. She said she knew that. I said that meant the deal was broken. She said she knew that too. I asked her what August had written about what happened when the deal broke. She said he had not written anything about that. I said that was not useful. She almost smiled. Almost. I picked up my phone and checked the signal. 2 bars. I opened the Maps app and pulled up the coordinates to the tunnel entrance. Then I opened August's journal to the diagram with the 2 columns. I looked at the status marks beside each symbol in the right column. Every entry had one, except the current one at the bottom. I looked at the marks more carefully. They were not all the same. Most were one symbol. A few were another. I asked Viv what the 2 different marks meant. She took the journal and looked at it under the kitchen light. She was quiet for a moment. She said the first mark appeared in August's key early on. She had translated it during our first session at this table. It meant returned. She found the second mark in the key and ran her finger along the translation she had written in margin. She looked up at me. She said the second mark meant sealed. I asked what sealed meant in this context. She said she did not know exactly, but that every entry marked sealed was from before 1900. Nothing after that had been sealed. Everything after that had been returned. I thought about that distinction. Return meant the deal had been kept and the person had come back up. Seal meant something different, something older, something that had stopped happening for reasons the journal did not explain. I asked Viv if there was any entry in August's notes about how the sealed status was achieved. She went back through the middle section of the journal. She found it near the journal's halfway point. August had written it in shorthand, but she worked through it with the key. She read it slowly. August had written that in the early period of contact, the surface people who encountered the tunnel system had sometimes found a way to close the arrangement permanently, not by running, not by refusing, by returning something to the tunnel that had come out of it, something that belonged below and had been brought above, something taken from the deep floor. He had written that the object in question was always the same kind of object, a record, something from the census, something that documented a name. I stood very still. I looked at the journal in Viv's hands. August's journal, the journal that had been hidden in a false bottom in a trunk in an attic, the journal that documented everything August had seen and done and given, the journal that was itself a record, a census entry, a name. I looked at Viv. She had reached the same place I had. I could see it. She held the journal out toward me, and neither of us spoke for a moment. Outside, the keeping sound continued in the dark, steady and patient, and waiting for something to be decided. I took the journal from Viv. I held it in both hands and looked at the cover. Dark brown leather with no title, no name, just a worn crease down the spine where it had been opened and closed hundreds of times. This was August's record, his full account, everything he had seen and done and traded away. It was the most complete census entry in the system, more complete than anything on that flat stone in the deep floor. And it had come up from below and away, not literally, but everything in it had originated down there. Every sketch, every entry, every name. It had started underground, and August had carried it to the surface and hidden it for me to find. I sat on the table. I looked at Viv and said we needed to go back tonight. She did not argue. She went to get her gear. The keeping sound stopped at 11:47. I know because I checked my phone when it happened, and the sudden silence was loud enough to notice. Viv came back to the kitchen with both packs and set them on the table. She had added 2 extra flashlights and the full battery pack from August's emergency drawer that she had found that afternoon. I picked up the journal and put it in my pack. Carefully, the same way you carry something that has a purpose and needs to arrive intact. We went out the front door because the keeping sound had been in the backyard. An old instinct said not to walk toward where a thing had just been. The night was cold and clear, and the gravel under our boots was loud in the quiet. I backed the truck out slowly with the headlights off until we cleared the tree line, and then I put them on. The fire trail was harder in the dark. I drove it in low gear with both hands on the wheel, and Viv braced against the dash. We parked at the rustic gate and got out. The walk-in felt different at night. The canopy blocked most of the stars, and the flashlight beams made the trees on either side look closer than they were. Viv walked slightly behind my left shoulder the way she had done the first time we came in, not out of deference, out of efficiency. 2 sets of eyes covering more ground. We reached the hillside without incident. The tunnel entrance sat in the dark exactly as we had left it, the gap in the fallen stone unchanged. I went in first. The cold hit me the same way it always did, dry and deliberate. I moved through the main passage at a steady pace without stopping to look at the carvings or the branch tunnels or August's initials. Viv matched my pace. We reached the widened section, and I swept my light across the walls. The tool marks had spread further again, more fresh cleared stone extending in both directions. Whatever work was happening in here was continuous. We did not stop. I found the low opening at the base of the wall by memory and went through without breaking stride. The crawl passage in the connecting corridor and the vertical shaft. We moved through all of it faster than we had before because we knew the route. I climbed the shaft downward this time. The handholds felt the same going down as they had going up, cold and worn in space for something built differently than I was. The warmth of the deep floor came up to meet me as I descended, and by the time my boots touched the bottom, the temperature had shifted back to that close living warmth that had nothing to do with heat sources. Viv dropped down beside me. We stood at the base of the shaft and listened. The cavern was quiet. The blue light pulsed from the structures in the same slow rhythm as before. I pulled out August's journal and found the sketch of the grid. I oriented myself against the nearest structure corner and found north the same way I had before. The gathering space was at the center. The flat stone was at the gathering space. That was where we needed to go. We moved through the passages between the structures at a steady walk. I kept the journal in my left hand and my flashlight in my right, and I did not look into the doorways of the structures as we passed them. I had learned enough about what was inside them. The grid passages were empty, no figures between the structures, no movement in the blue-lit doorways. The cavern had the same quality as before, functioning on its own schedule, running without requiring witnesses. We reached the gathering space, and I stopped at the edge of the carved floor. The flat stone was in the center where we had left it. The ancient census journal was still on top of it. The carved geometric spirals on the floor looked the same in the flashlight beam as they had before. I stepped onto the carved floor and crossed to the stone. Viv stayed at the edge. I set my flashlight on the stone pointing up, so the beam spread across the ceiling and gave us both light to work with. I took August's journal out of my pack and held it. I looked at it for a moment, not with sentiment exactly, more with the recognition that this was the end of something that had started in the spring of 1943 and had been running ever since. August had carried this weight for 80 years and had managed it the only way he could, and had eventually found the one exit that did not require him to hurt anyone he was still close to. He had left it for me. I did not feel grateful for that. I did not feel angry either. I felt the same thing I had felt walking through the grid passages. Clear, focused, present in the task. I placed August's journal on the flat stone beside the ancient census record. I set it down flat with the spine facing up and both hands on the cover for a moment before I let go. The moment I lifted my hands, the blue light in the nearest structure changed. The pulse slowed. One long, slow breath of light instead of the steady rhythm. Then it returned to normal. Then the one beside it did the same thing. Then the next. The change moved outward from the gathering space through the entire grid, like a signal passing from one point to the next. Every structure in the cavern cycling through that one long, slow pulsing sequence, moving away from us in every direction until the last one at the far edge of the dark completed its cycle, and the whole system returned to its regular rhythm. Viv said my name quietly from the edge of the carved floor. I picked up my flashlight and walked back to her. She was looking at the passages around the clearing. I looked too. Nothing in them. No figures at the edges of the light. Just the empty grid and the blue glow and the silence. We moved back to the passages toward the shaft. I counted the same landmarks in reverse. Same structure corners. Same narrow turns. We reached the shaft and I went up first. The climb felt longer going up than it had going down. My arms burned by the top, and I pulled myself out onto the corridor floor and lay there breathing for a moment before I got up. Viv came up behind me. We moved through the connecting corridor and back into the crawl passage and up through the low opening into the main tunnel. I stood up in the widened section and swept my flashlight across the walls. The fresh tool marks were still there, but the stone dust on the floor was undisturbed. Nothing had moved through here while we were below. We walked the main passage back toward the entrance at a steady pace. August's initials passed on my right without me stopping. The 4-word warning. I had come back twice after reading it, and both times the tunnel had let me leave. I went through the entrance gap, and the outside air hit my face, and I stood in the dark hillside for a moment with my eyes closed. Viv came through behind me. We walked back through the forest of the truck without speaking. The trees were just trees. The dark was just dark. Nothing followed. Nothing watched. I started the engine, and we drove back down the fire trail and onto the paved road, and I did not look in the rearview mirror once. We got back to August's house at 2 a.m, and I sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, and Viv sat across from me, and we did not talk about what we had done. There was not much to say. The journal was gone. The deal was closed. August's name was in the sealed column. Now, even if he was not alive to know it, I looked at the table where the journal had been sitting for the past 2 days. The rectangle of cleared space where it had rested was still faintly visible in the dust. I reached out and smoothed it away with my hand. Viv said she was going to get some sleep. I said I would be in soon. She went down the hall, and I sat alone in August's kitchen with my coffee going cold and the house completely quiet around me. I thought about the 2 kinds of entries. I thought about August picking missing persons carefully for 80 years and telling himself it was acceptable. I thought about the connection between the surface and whatever was below it, a relationship that had been running longer than any government or institution above ground, hidden under every hill and field and city, patient and organized in keeping its own records. I drank the last of the cold coffee and set the mug in the sink. I turned the kitchen light off. I went to bed. For the first time since I found the trunk in August's attic, I slept without dreaming. I woke up the next morning to Viv standing in the doorway of the spare room with her phone in her hand. She said she had been checking the photos she had taken on the walls of the tunnel during our visits. She said something was different in the photos from the second visit compared to the first. I sat up. She turned the phone toward me and showed me 2 photos side by side. Same section of wall. Same carved geometric bands. In the first photo, the patterns ran their usual course. Triangles and converging lines. In the second photo taken 24 hours later, there was a new element added to the pattern. A single horizontal band that had not been there the day before, running the full width of the section she had photographed. She zoomed in on the new band. It was not geometric. It was text, the same writing system as the census entries and the carved symbols throughout the tunnel, but arranged in a single unbroken line. She said she had worked through it with August's key that morning while I was sleeping. She held the phone closer. She said the line read, record received, terms closed, passage granted. I read it twice on her screen. I looked at Viv. She said there was one more line below it that she had not translated yet. When she came to wake me, she scrolled the photo down. The line below was shorter. For symbols, she read from her keynotes. She said it translated as, return when ready. I sat with that for a moment. Return when ready. Not a threat, not a warning, An open door left in the record for whenever I decided I wanted to go back. I got up and went to the kitchen and made coffee. I stood at the counter while it brewed and looked out the window at the backyard in the morning light. Just grass and trees and the flat, ordinary daylight of a late October morning in West Virginia. Nothing wrong with any of it. I poured 2 cups and brought one to Viv, and we sat at August's kitchen table in the quiet house and drank our coffee. I did not know what return when ready meant in practical terms. I did not know what would happen if I went back down without a deal in place. I did not know how much of what August had written was the full picture, and how much was the version he had been able to bring himself to put into words. There was a lot I did not know. What I knew was that the journal was gone and the house was quiet, and the keeping sound had not come back. That was enough for now. I spent 3 more days in August's house before I drove back home. There was still estate work to finish, documents to sign and furniture to arrange for donation, and a house to list with a local agent who had known August by name and asked no questions about why it had taken the family so long to come down. I told her I was the only family. She nodded and handed me a clipboard. I signed what needed signing and left her a key and walked back to the truck without looking at the attic window. The drive home took 6 hours. Viv followed in her own car as far as the interstate, and then we split off in different directions. She texted me when she got home. I texted back. We did not talk about the tunnel, or the journal, or the carved message in the wall. Not because it was too much to discuss, but because there was nothing left in it that required discussion. We had done what needed doing. The thing was closed. I went back to work the following Monday. Sat at the same desk where I had been sitting when the call about August came in. Finished the report I had abandoned that Tuesday in October. Turned it in. Got a reply from my manager saying good work. Life ran at its normal pace, and I let it. I cooked meals and paid bills and called my mother on Sundays the way I always had, and did not mention August's journal or what Viv and I had found in the Appalachian hills 12 miles from his house. 2 weeks after I got home, I started doing research. Not about the tunnel, about August. I pulled his service records from a National Archives online request portal, his geological survey contracts from the Federal Registry, old newspaper archives from the West Virginia county where he had lived. I was not looking for anything specific. I was building a picture of who he had been before 1943, before the spring that changed everything. What I found was a man who had been unremarkable in the best way, competent at his work, liked by his colleagues according to 2 letters of reference I found in his service file. No disciplinary record, no gaps in employment. He had been 23 years old when he went into that tunnel for the first time. I thought about that. 23 with a lantern and a survey kit, and no framework for what he was about to encounter. He had handled it the only way available to him. He had made a deal and kept it and spent the rest of his life managing the consequences of that deal as carefully as he could. He had not been a good man, exactly. What he had given away to stay alive had cost other people things they had not agreed to lose. But he had been a careful man, a deliberate man, a man who had spent 80 years thinking about the weight of what he carried, and had eventually found the one exit that did not require one more name. My name on the journal cover had not been an accident or a guess. He had known I was the right person to finish it. I did not know how he had known that, and I had decided not to spend too much time trying to figure it out. In the 4th week after I came home, I drove back to West Virginia, not to the tunnel, to the county records office in the nearest town to August's house. I had found a reference in one of the old newspaper archives to a missing persons case from 1962. A man whose last known location had been a stretch of Appalachian backcountry that overlapped with August survey territory. The case had never been solved. I pulled the full file. The man had been 34 years old. No family listed as next of kin. Reported missing by a co-worker after he failed to show up for 2 weeks. The investigating officer's notes said no evidence of foul play, no evidence of anything. He had simply stopped being present in the world one day, and the world had eventually stopped looking. I sat with the file for a long time in the county records room with the fluorescent light humming above me and the smell of old paper around me. August had written that he stopped believing it was acceptable around 1962. This man's file had a date on the missing persons report, March of 1962. I put the file back in its folder and returned it to the clerk and drove back to the interstate. I did not go back to the county records office after that. I knew enough. Knowing more would not change what had happened, and would not change what I had done, and would not change the fact that the journal was sealed in a census record miles below the surface of the earth, where it was always going to end up eventually. I thought about the last line Viv had translated from the wall. Return when ready. I thought about it the way you think about a door you have no plans to open, but cannot quite stop looking at. The coordinates were still in my phone. I had not deleted them. I told myself I would delete them eventually, and I believed that when I said it. I got home late that evening and made dinner and sat at my kitchen table and ate alone in a quiet apartment in a quiet building on a quiet street. Nothing kept sound in the backyard. Nothing carved my name into anything. The deal was closed and the record was sealed, and August's name was in the right column now, and that was the end of it. I washed my plate and dried it and put it away. I sat back down at the table. I picked up my phone. I looked at the coordinates sitting in my saved locations under a pin I had never labeled. I set the phone face down on the table. I left it there and went to bed. I did not delete them. In the 6th week, I found Viv's research notes in my email. She had sent them the night before without a message attached, just a folder of files. I opened them over coffee on a Saturday morning and read through what she had put together. She had been doing the same kind of work I had been doing, but further back, not 1962, much further. She had pulled geological survey, records going back to the 1800s, and cross-referenced them against missing persons cases in counties above the Appalachian cave systems. The pattern held across 150 years. Not large numbers or dramatic clusters. A steady low frequency of people going into the backcountry and not coming out. Always spread thin enough to look like accidents. Never concentrated enough to draw real investigative resources. She had mapped it. I opened the file and looked at the dots spread across 4 states. Hundreds of them over a century and a half. Each one a name in the census on the flat stone. Each one a deal kept or broken or passed along the way August had passed me. I thought about the journal on the stone, the older one bound in something that was not leather. How many records like it might be sitting in those carved shelves? How far back they went. I closed the map and looked out the window at ordinary Saturday morning traffic. People with dogs. A kid on a bike. All of them walking above ground without a thought for what was below it. Viv had not included a note, and I did not call her. I already knew we were not going to do anything with the information. There was no authority to bring it to. No institution equipped to handle the census kept in a cavern below the tectonic plates by something older than our language for ground itself. The only thing it changed was what I knew. I replied to her email with one line. I said I had read it. She wrote back that she figured I would want to know. I said she was right. That was the last we spoke of it. I went back to the coordinates that evening and sat with my thumb over the delete button for 30 seconds. I put the phone down and looked out the window and thought about August spending 40 years alone at the end of gravel road, keeping distance and filling shelves with notebooks he never wrote in. I understood the distance now. I understood why every person you let close becomes a weight to manage. Some records are better left empty. I picked the phone back up and looked at the pin sitting over a stretch of Appalachian hillside that looked like every other stretch from above. No mark on the surface for what was below. Just trees and rock, and a place that kept its own counsel. I set the phone down. I did not delete the coordinates. I was done lying to myself about when I would. I finished out the month and listed August's house. It sold quickly to a couple from out of state who wanted land and quiet and a project. I signed the closing documents remotely and wired the proceeds into an account I did not spend from. August had bought that house with 40 years of managed guilt, and whatever I did with the money, it would carry some of that weight. The closing happened on a Thursday, and by Friday I was back at my desk doing ordinary things. The coordinates stayed in my phone. I stopped looking at them every day, then every few days, then once a week on Sunday mornings before I called my mother. A small ritual I had not decided to start. I thought about the line carved in the wall, return when ready. I did not know what ready meant or what returning, without a deal in place, would produce. There were things in August's journal I had understood at the time, and things I understood only later, and things I suspected I had not understood at all. The journal was gone, sealed in the record below. What remained was only what I had kept in my own memory from 2 days at August's kitchen table. I knew that was not a complete record. On a Sunday in late January, I drove back to August's old house and parked at the end of the gravel road. The new owners had started working on it. Fresh paint on the porch, a new mailbox. The oak trees were bare, and the house looked smaller without their cover. A light was on in the kitchen window. Someone making breakfast with no idea what had been hidden in the attic above them for 80 years. I sat there for 10 minutes and then drove back to the interstate. On the drive home, I thought about what August had really left me. Not just the exit from the deal, the knowledge itself, that below every hill and road and city block, there was something keeping record since before we arrived on the surface. It was not malicious. It was thorough. It had noticed us the way a careful archivist notices everything that passes through. I got home and sat at my kitchen table in the thin January light with my phone in front of me. I thought about the keeping sound standing in August's backyard with all the patience of something that had never needed to rush. I thought about the figure at the edge of the lantern, light, waiting for a decision. I thought about the 2 columns on the flat stone and the marks beside every name. I set the phone down and looked at my hands. The coordinates were still there. I was not ready, but I was starting to understand what ready might feel like when it arrived.